They told us, the Americans are savages, barbarians who demand vengeance. But what if their kindness is the most brutal weapon of all? Texas, 1,944. The heat pressed down like a weight, heavy and dry. A U.S. Army truck, raising a long plume of dust, rolled across the cracked asphalt toward Camp Hearn. Inside sat 12 German women, prisoners, officers, wives, secretaries, nurses. They clutched their small cases, staring straight ahead, rigid with anxiety. They had been indoctrinated that the Americans were brutal. They expected jeering crowds, guards with rifles ready to strike, perhaps even humiliation reserved specifically for women in enemy hands. Instead, when the gate opened, the guards barely looked at them. A young Texan in a sweat-darkened hat simply said, "Welcome to Camp Hearn, ma'am." It wasn't kindness they felt. It was profound confusion. The air smelled of hay and dust, not fear. They were led to long, bare wooden barracks, identical to the men's quarters. Inside, clean cots, neatly folded blankets, and, to their utter disbelief, open washrooms with rows of sinks and toilets, completely devoid of partitions, offering no separate space for women. For a long, stunned moment, no one moved. Then Helga, a colonel's wife, her face pale, whispered, This is how they disgrace us. They violate our purity." Another woman, Elsa, ever the sharper observer, shook her head slowly. "No, this is how they see us, as nothing special." It was a small, almost absurd detail, yet in that instant, something profound fractured. These women, raised in a culture obsessed with rank, order, and gender purity, suddenly found themselves in a world where none of it mattered. Here, the guards ate the same food as the prisoners. Here, titles meant nothing. One of the Texans noticed their confusion and chuckled softly. "Ma'am," he said, gesturing vaguely at the fields, "out here everyone's equal, even the cows." The women didn't laugh. They didn't understand. But in that dusty Texas camp, the simple, unspoken, jarring normality of equality had just begun to do something no weapon ever could. For the first time since their capture, they weren't being punished. They were being redefined, and that, to them, was far more unsettling. By the summer of 1944, America was holding more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war across the United States. Most were German soldiers, but a small number were women nurses, clerks, translators, and officers' wives brought to the U.S. for safety and labor assignments. They arrived expecting vengeance, but instead they found an orderly system grounded in something they couldn't quite comprehend: rules. The Geneva Convention, signed decades earlier, required humane treatment for all prisoners. The U.S. took that obligation seriously, down to the last detail. In Camp Hearn, the German women were housed in simple barracks, provided with clean uniforms, daily meals, and assigned work duties. They were given medical care, allowed to write letters home, and even permitted to attend Sunday services. None of it made sense to them. Back home, Nazi propaganda had promised that capture meant degradation, that Americans were barbaric opportunists who would exploit and destroy them. But here, the guards acted with quiet professionalism. They didn't shout, they didn't leer. They simply followed procedure. When the women complained about the lack of separate toilets or private quarters, the American officer in charge merely replied, "The convention doesn't distinguish between men and women. You're soldiers too, aren't you?" That single statement, equating them with soldiers, hit harder than any insult could have. In Germany, they had been told their duty was to serve men, to support the Reich from the shadows. In America, they were being treated, whether they liked it or not, as equals. Some of the women took it as humiliation. Others saw something deeper forming beneath the surface, a kind of silent respect that didn't need words, uniforms, or hierarchy. Days turned into weeks, and the mechanical rhythm of captivity began to settle. They rose with the bugle, ate meals prepared by army cooks, worked in the fields or laundry, and returned to the barracks by sunset. It was predictable, almost dull, but within that monotony was a quiet revelation. Discipline without fear. The Americans didn't rule by threat or ideology. They ruled by order and fairness. It was alien to the German mind, trained under command and consequence. Late one evening, Helga wrote in her small notebook, "They do not shout, but we obey. They do not hate, but we feel small." Perhaps this is what strength without cruelty looks like. For the German women, life inside the Texas camp was a daily clash between everything they had been taught and everything they were now forced to witness. From childhood, they were told that civilization meant hierarchy. Officers commanded, workers obeyed, and women existed to serve quietly behind the lines. The Reich had promised them order, purity, and pride. But America was chaos in its purest, most functional form. At Camp Hearn, the schedule was simple. Breakfast at dawn, labor by mid-morning, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. There were no banners, no speeches, no barking sergeants, just a rhythm, mechanical, calm, and almost insultingly ordinary. Even more shocking was the lack of rigid separation. The women were expected to share fields and duties with Italian and even Japanese prisoners. There were no distinctions based on rank, nationality, or gender. A colonel's wife found herself scrubbing laundry beside a captured sailor. A nurse stitched uniforms next to a farmer's daughter from Bavaria. At first, resentment simmered. "They strip us of our dignity," Helga hissed one evening. "They make us peasants." Elsa, ever more observant, replied quietly, "No, they make us equal." That word equal landed like a stone in the silence of the barracks. The Americans didn't flaunt their authority. They simply exercised it without cruelty. Guards spoke with a kind of friendly detachment, never mocking, never leering. One young Texan brought buckets of cold water to the women working outside, offering a brief smile before walking off. "You folks are tougher than us," he joked. They were used to power wrapped in fear. Here, power came wrapped in decency. Day after day, small gestures chipped away at the armor of ideology. The same food was served to everyone. The same soap was distributed at the showers. The same doctor treated a German fever and a guard's cough. When one of the POWs fell ill, the camp nurse, a woman from Kansas, stayed up all night tending to her. "Enemy or not, a fever's a fever," she said. It wasn't pity that stunned them. It was normality. Helga began to watch the Americans closely. How they spoke to each other. How even privates addressed officers with ease. How laughter came without needing permission. Once, a group of guards sat around a campfire singing folk songs. Without thinking, Helga found herself humming along. The melody was foreign, but the warmth was familiar. Later that night, she wrote in her small notebook, "They do not break us with cruelty. They undo us with kindness. The strength of these people lies not in their weapons, but in their calm." For the first time, she began to wonder if victory and virtue were not the same thing. By the end of the week, the camp no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a mirror, forcing each of them to see how hollow their old beliefs had been. And somewhere in that dusty Texas evening, between the smell of hay and the distant laughter of cowboys, the unthinkable happened. Enemies began to feel like people. By late summer 1944, the rhythm of the camp had settled into something that felt almost like life before the war. Except this time, the women were on the other side of the fence. Yet what unsettled them most wasn't the captivity itself. It was how the Americans carried themselves. Their discipline wasn't born of fear, but of choice. Their authority didn't need shouting, and their pride didn't need ceremony. The German women had grown up in a system where every movement, every decision was dictated by rank and ideology. In Nazi Germany, one's worth was measured by obedience. But in Texas, they saw something different. The quiet, unpretentious confidence of a people who didn't need to prove anything. The guards weren't polished or rigid. They wore their uniforms loose, their hats tilted, their sleeves rolled. They called their superiors by name. sometimes even joked with them. And yet the work still got done. Orders were followed, not because of fear, but because everyone trusted one another to do their part. One day, during a repair detail, Helga saw two American soldiers arguing good-naturedly over a broken fence section. The sergeant, barely older than a boy, told the corporal to fix it his way. The corporal shook his head, laughed, and said, "Mine will hold through the next storm." The sergeant grinned and shrugged. "Fine. Let's see whose fence survives." Helga watched, stunned. In Germany, disobedience, even with humor, meant punishment. Here, it meant initiative. Later, she whispered to Elsa, "They don't fear each other." Elsa nodded slowly. "That's why they win." The camp reflected that same philosophy in every corner. The kitchens ran smoothly because everyone contributed. The workshops were efficient, not from orders, but from cooperation. Even the guards rotated duties to avoid exhaustion. No one lorded over anyone else. Yet the system worked flawlessly. It was, Helga realized, the same invisible force that made American industry so unstoppable. Ordinary people trusted to make extraordinary things happen. In one of her diary entries, she wrote, "They do not bow to leaders. They trust their own hands." The shock deepened when the women learned that most of these guards were not professional soldiers, but farmers, teachers, and ranch hands before the war. They weren't soldiers trained for cruelty. They were civilians, trained for decency. And they had carried that same decency into war. At Sunday services, the chaplain spoke of forgiveness. "A man's worth," he said, "isn't measured by what side he's on, but what he does when he's given power." The German women sat quietly, not daring to meet each other's eyes. For the first time, the words of an enemy priest made sense. Over the following weeks, something began to change. The women no longer flinched at the sight of guards. They began to greet them, sometimes even exchange polite smiles. The Americans noticed, but said nothing. They didn't have to. Helga finally understood the source of that quiet strength. America's power didn't come from its weapons or its factories. It came from its people, free men, unafraid of one another. The shift from fear to familiarity came slowly. Then one afternoon it went too far. It was September, 1944. The sun hung heavy over the Texas sky, bleaching the fields gold. A group of German women prisoners worked alongside Italian POWs, mending fences and tending to livestock under the supervision of two young Texan guards. The work was monotonous, but the air felt different, lighter, easier. Laughter even broke out now and then. Among them was Helga, who had begun to see the guards not as enemies, but as men who simply wanted to get through another day. One of them, Private Jesse McCaffrey, couldn't have been older than 20. He spoke with a drawl so thick that Helga barely understood him, but his tone was always gentle. At noon, when the heat became unbearable, McCaffrey removed his hat and waved the group toward the barn. "Break time, ladies," he said with a grin. "Ain't no war under this roof." Inside, he opened a small crate and handed out bottles of water. Then, without thinking, passed one to Helga first. The moment froze. The Italians laughed softly, but the German women went silent. To a Texan, it was simple courtesy. To a German, it was a social scandal. That night in the barracks, Elsa fumed. "He insulted us, offering water like we are equals. They treat us as if we are children, not prisoners." But Helga said nothing. She sat on her cot, staring at the bottle, now empty, resting by her feet. For her, it wasn't an insult. It was something she had never experienced before. Respect without agenda. The next day, the camp's commandant summoned McCaffrey for a quiet word. The guards had reported the incident. Though no punishment followed, he was warned, "Keep your distance. The rules exist for a reason." But distance was impossible in a place like Camp Hearn, where human contact blurred lines every day. When men and women worked side by side under the same sky, when the enemy became a neighbor, those rules began to fray. Weeks later, another small act shattered the old world entirely. The women were led to a field for riding lessons. An experiment, the guards called it. to keep the POWs healthy and occupied. The horses had been restless without work, and one of the cowboys suggested letting the women ride. When Helga mounted a chestnut mare, the camp went silent. Even the American officers paused to watch. Her posture was perfect, her eyes cold and proud, until the wind caught her hair and something in her face broke open. She smiled. It was the first time anyone in that camp had seen her smile. For the guards, it was just a moment of simple humanity. For the German women watching, it was unthinkable, a former Nazi officer's wife riding a horse, smiling under the gaze of Americans. The shock wasn't about scandal. It was about freedom. For the first time since the war began, Helga looked. That evening, she wrote in her diary, "I thought captivity would take my dignity. Instead, it gave me back my soul." By autumn 1944, the arithmetic of pride had started to fail. Everything the German women believed about power, order, and superiority was unraveling. Not through punishment or propaganda, but through decency. Each day, the same equations repeated themselves. They were fed more than the soldiers at the front. They slept in safety while Berlin burned. They received medicine when German civilians starved. In every measure of war, the numbers no longer made sense. The real shock came when the camp chaplain shared a statistic during a Sunday service. The United States was spending more than $1.8 billion to house Axis prisoners humanely, more than Germany spent feeding its own army. The women sat in stunned silence. It wasn't generosity. It was philosophy. America believed in rules, even when no one was watching. It was the math of morality. Feed your enemy to prove you're stronger than hate. Helga tried to resist the feeling rising inside her, a mix of shame and awe. For years, she had been told that kindness was weakness, that compassion was a flaw. Yet here her captors treated her with a fairness she had never received from her own leaders. Elsa broke first. One night as they returned from work, she stopped beside the fence, staring at the open sky. "Do you realize what they've done?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "They've defeated us without firing a shot." No one answered, but everyone knew she was right. The realization spread quietly through the camp. It showed in how the women spoke less about Germany and more about what they were learning about freedom, dignity, and the strange democracy that governed even a prison. The guards noticed it too. The prisoners stood straighter, spoke softer. The line between captor and captive blurred into something almost human. One morning, when a sandstorm swept across the camp, the guards and POWs worked together to secure the tents. There were no orders, no shouting, just instinctive cooperation. Later, over coffee, one Texan remarked, "Hell, if Hitler had let folks work like that, he might have won." That night, Helga wrote in her diary, "In the Reich, obedience was survival. Here it is, respect. We have not been conquered by force, but by fairness." By the winter of 1944, pride had given way to understanding. These women, once symbols of a collapsing empire, had begun to grasp what made America impossible to defeat. Not its bombs, not its factories, but its belief that decency multiplied by millions could outlast cruelty. And as Helga closed her diary, she added one final line that history would never record, but that defined the quiet collapse of ideology. "They defeated us without a single insult, just food." By January 1945, word from the Texas camps began to slip through the cracks of censorship, carried not by spies or diplomats, but by ink and memory. Each German POW was allowed to write letters home, carefully inspected, censored for military detail. But what the guards didn't realize was that the most dangerous thing those letters carried wasn't intelligence. It was truth. Helga's first letter began simply, "To my sister Anna, I am alive. The Americans are not as we were told." She described the food, the treatment, the strange politeness of the guards. She told Anna about the day she rode the horse, about the kindness of the cowboy who handed her the reins without hesitation. She wrote of how they were called by name, not by number, and how she no longer feared the sunrise. The censors let it pass. It was harmless, they thought, just another prisoner finding hope. But when the letter reached Bavaria, it was read and reread in whispers, then copied by hand, then passed from home to home. Soon dozens of similar letters followed. We are treated better here than by our own officers. The Americans share their food with us. They allow us to speak freely. Each word chipped away at the myth of Nazi superiority. In one camp in Germany, a soldier's mother read her son's letter aloud to a neighbor. The Americans feed us meat, real meat. They don't shout. They don't humiliate us. The neighbor wept silently. Her own son had died on the Eastern Front, starving. Even back in Texas, the guards noticed the change in the women who wrote those letters. Their handwriting softened. The tone grew less formal, less defiant. When the mail truck arrived, Helga and the others waited eagerly, not for news from Germany, but for a chance to send a piece of America back. The American officers began to sense it too. Captain Rexford, the camp's senior officer, once read a translated letter aloud to his men. She says we've treated her as people, not enemies. She says the world should learn from that. The barracks went silent. Then someone muttered, "Maybe that's how we win, sir." Weeks later, one of those letters made its way into a German newspaper. Not through censorship, but by quiet defiance. The editor published it anonymously, calling it a prisoner's confession. The Nazi propaganda office quickly pulled it, but not before it spread through small towns, read aloud in cellars, and whispered through church pews. By spring 1945, hundreds of German civilians had heard rumors of the Americans who treated their prisoners humanely. They didn't believe all of it, but the idea alone was enough to plant doubt. In her final letter before repatriation, Helga wrote, "If we are to rebuild anything after this, we must begin where they did, with kindness." That letter never reached Germany. It was intercepted and filed away in military archives. But decades later, historians would find it still folded, still legible. It was dated February 18th, 1945. And beneath her signature, Helga had written one more line: "The war is ending, but I think I have already been set free." Spring came to Texas quietly that year. The mesquite trees bloomed pale yellow. The fields warmed again, and the war, though still raging across Europe, began to feel distant. For the women inside Camp Hearn, work, meals, sunsets, and the faint sound of cattle beyond the fences had become their rhythm. Then one day, a familiar silhouette appeared at the gate. A man in a Stetson hat, dust-covered boots, and that same half-smile they remembered. It was the cowboy, Jesse McCaffrey, the same one who had helped Helga onto the horse months earlier. The guard saluted casually as he approached. No one stopped him. He wasn't military. He didn't need permission. He carried something in his hand. A small jar, wrapped in cloth. When he reached Helga's work detail, he raised it slightly and said, "Brought something. My wife made it. Strawberry preserves." The women froze. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Food gifts were strictly forbidden, and any personal contact with guards, especially men, was risky. Yet the cowboy's tone was easy, almost innocent, like a neighbor dropping by with kindness that needed no approval. Helga stepped forward. "Why?" she asked softly, her German accent still thick, but her English clearer now. He shrugged. "War's nearly over. Thought you might want to taste something sweet before you go home." It was an impossible moment. No salutes, no orders, no hate. Just two people who should have been enemies standing in the Texas sun, separated by a fence, but not by fear. Helga hesitated, then reached through the wire. Their hands brushed briefly as she took the jar. Neither spoke. The air around them seemed to hold its breath. From a distance, one of the guards watched. He later said it was the first handshake he'd seen in that camp, and the last. That night, Helga opened the jar. The other women gathered around, and she dipped her finger into the ruby-red preserves, tasting it like a relic from another world. For a moment she closed her eyes and smiled. Elsa whispered, He shouldn't have done that. It's against orders. Helga looked up at her and said quietly, "Yes, but so was kindness." The next morning, the cowboy returned to his ranch for good. But before he left, he tipped his hat toward the camp. It was a small gesture, unnoticed by most. Yet for Helga, it meant more than any uniform or medal ever could. When the war finally ended weeks later and the camp prepared to send the POWs home, Helga wrote one final note and left it on the barracks table. It read, "To the cowboy, you taught me what victory means. It is not power, it is mercy." Years later, long after the fences were torn down and the barracks rotted away, the cowboy's grandson would find that note folded inside an old photograph of Camp Hearn. No name, no signature, just that one sentence. And he would say to a local historian, "Granddad always said the hardest thing he ever did in the war was shake a prisoner's hand. I guess now I know why." By the summer of 1945, the camp began to thin out. Trains came one after another, carrying prisoners east toward ships that would take them home. The barbed wire that once symbolized captivity now looked almost like protection, the last familiar thing before the uncertainty of post-war Germany. Helga stood by the fence one final morning, watching the sun rise over the Texas plains. The same fields where she'd once been terrified now looked peaceful, endless. A few guards were still there. Young men who'd spent 2 years guarding prisoners who no longer felt like enemies. One of them, Corporal Mason, handed her a small paper bag as she boarded the truck. Inside was a folded napkin and a biscuit wrapped in wax paper. "For the road," he said simply. She wanted to say something. Anything. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded. As the convoy rolled away, the camp shrank behind her. The wind blew warm against her face, and for the first time she realized she was crying not from fear or despair, but from gratitude. In her final journal entry, written on the ship back to Europe, she tried to make sense of it all. "They called them cowboys," she wrote. "We called them fools, but it turns out the fools were us." That line, like so many others, would never make it into any official record. But it survived in oral histories, in fragments retold by POWs who came home and found no one ready to believe them. To speak well of the enemy was unthinkable, almost treasonous, yet many did quietly. One former prisoner recalled, "I came to America hating everything about it. I left wishing I could stay." In the years that followed, Helga and Elsa found work helping rebuild what was left of their town. Food was scarce, hope even scarcer. Yet whenever someone cursed the Americans, Helga would stop them. "You did not meet the ones I met," she'd say. Her diary became her secret weapon, proof that compassion could outlast any ideology. And when her children later asked what the war had taught her, she answered without hesitation, "That power isn't in force, it's in fairness." Back in Texas, the cowboy lived out his days quietly, never boasting about what he'd done. When asked about the prisoners, he'd shrug and say, "They were just folks. War don't change that." Decades later, historians would find that the Texas POW camps had some of the lowest escape and violence rates in the world. The reason wasn't fear or fences. It was respect. The barbecue, the preserves, the small acts of grace, they became the real victory. For Helga, that victory wasn't about armies or flags. It was the day she realized that America's greatest weapon wasn't its might, it was its mercy. And in a world torn apart by hate, that single truth would echo long after the war ended. They defeated us not with bombs or bullets, but with the simple, unbearable power of kindness. As the final transport ships pulled away from the American coast, the POWs leaned on the railings and watched the shoreline fade into mist. Some wept quietly. Others simply stood in silence, holding the last letters they'd written, but never sent. Helga stood among them, still clutching that biscuit from Texas, long hardened but untouched. She couldn't throw it away. It wasn't food anymore. It was proof. Proof that in the heart of war, mercy had survived. Back in Texas, the ranches returned to normal life. The campgrounds were dismantled, the barbed wire taken down. Grass covered the soil where soldiers once stood guard. But the stories, those didn't fade. Years later, when visitors came asking about the war, the old cowboys would tell the same story, almost reverently. There was this German lady once. We let her ride a horse. She cried the whole time, but it wasn't from fear. In history books, the war was decided by numbers. Tanks built, bombs dropped, men lost. But in the memories of those who lived it, victory was something smaller, quieter, a kindness that refused to die. They mocked the cowboy. The story went, and he fed them instead. The lesson wasn't written in any military manual. Yet, it outlived every order and uniform, because in the end, mercy proved to be the strongest form of power, the one weapon no enemy could ever conquer. History remembers wars for who won them, but those who lived through this one remembered something deeper, that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones where no one falls.